When we speak of death, it is often spoken of in the tone of finality, as if it were the closing of a book, the extinguishing of a flame, the irreversible end of all that we are. Our language betrays this assumption. We say someone is gone, that life has been cut short, that there is nothing after. These words reflect the deep cultural belief that death represents an absolute conclusion, a door that locks from the inside, never to be opened again. Yet this assumption itself is worth questioning, because if we look carefully at nature, at the rhythms of life, and at our own direct experience, the idea of death as a final end becomes far less certain. Consider the cycles of the natural world. The tree in autumn sheds its leaves, and to the casual eye, the tree looks barren, lifeless, finished. But in that shedding, in that apparent death, is the preparation for spring. The soil receives the fallen leaves, breaks them down, and transforms them into nourishment for new life. What appears as loss is simultaneously a transformation, a redistribution of energy, a continuation in a different form. Nothing is wasted, and nothing truly ends. It merely changes appearance. Death, in this way, is not final at all. It is simply the shifting of forms, the recycling of being. This is not only observed in the grand patterns of seasons and forests, but also in the smaller, more immediate rhythms of our own existence. Each breath we take is a miniature rehearsal of death and renewal. The inhale gathers life, the exhale releases it. To hold on to the breath, refusing to let it go, would mean suffocation. It is in letting go, in allowing the exhale to dissolve, that the next breath is made possible. In the same way, clinging to the idea of life as a fixed and permanent possession blinds us to the very movement that allows it to flow. Life cannot be frozen and stored. It is fluid, and its flow requires the ebb, the pause, the dissolution we call death. The illusion of finality arises because our minds crave certainty. We like to divide things into beginnings and endings, into linear narratives with a clear start and a definite finish. But life does not conform to this neat structure. It is more like a circle, or perhaps more accurately, like a spiral. Always moving, always transforming, never quite in the same place twice, but also never truly stopping. To say that death is the end is to mistake one chapter for the whole story. To believe that the silence between musical notes is the death of the song, rather than its essential rhythm. One of the reasons this illusion grips us so tightly is that we confuse identity with continuity. We imagine ourselves as a solid and permanent self, a fixed character moving through time. And so, when death threatens the continuity of this self, we interpret it as annihilation. But if we look more closely, this self is not as solid as we think. You are not the same person you were 10 years ago, nor even yesterday. Your body has shed and replaced its cells countless times. Your thoughts, your emotions, your memories have shifted and evolved. In every moment, tiny deaths have already occurred. The death of an old cell, the death of a fleeting thought, the death of a version of yourself that no longer exists. And yet here you are, still alive, still unfolding. What you call you is a process, not a thing, and processes do not end, they transform. Think also of water. A wave rises upon the ocean and crashes back down. To say the wave has died is to miss the truth. The wave was never separate from the ocean. It was simply the ocean expressing itself in a particular form for a brief time before dissolving back into its source. And when it disappears, nothing is lost. It is still the ocean, and from that same ocean, new waves will rise. In this way, what we call death is the falling back of the wave into the sea of existence, and what we call birth is the arising of a new wave. To believe in the finality of death is to forget that both the rising and falling are expressions of the same endless ocean. The fear of finality is deeply tied to our imagination of nothingness. We imagine death as a great void, a dark abyss into which we fall, never to return. But notice how this picture is itself an act of imagination. We imagine nothing, as though it were something, as though we could stand outside it and look into it. Yet before you were born, there was no sense of terror in the fact that you did not exist. There was no darkness, no void, no abyss. It was not an experience of absence. It was simply not there to be experienced. And after death, it will be no different. The illusion is thinking of death as though it were a state of being, when in fact, it is simply the dissolution of a temporary form back into the flow from which it came. The illusion of finality also carries with it a hidden arrogance. The belief that our individual life must be preserved at all costs, that our particular form of consciousness is the ultimate measure of existence. But life itself is far more vast than any individual. Just as countless generations came before you, and countless will follow, so too does life continue endlessly in forms we cannot foresee. To cling to the idea of finality is to overlook the sheer abundance of existence, the creativity that never stops, the dance that endlessly transforms itself into new patterns and new expressions. When we begin to look carefully at life, we notice that it never moves in straight lines. Instead, it moves in patterns, rhythms, and cycles. Everything is born, grows, declines, and transforms, only to give rise to something else. The cycle of renewal is not an abstract idea. It is the very pulse of existence, the way the universe sustains itself. To see this clearly is to realize that life and death are not enemies, not opposites locked in conflict, but companions in an eternal dance, each depending on the other for meaning and expression. Without death, life would lose its vitality, and without life, death would have no stage upon which to appear. Nature reveals this cycle everywhere. Watch the turning of the seasons. Spring blossoms into summer. Summer ripens into autumn, and autumn surrenders to winter. Yet winter is never the end, though it looks like barren stillness. Beneath the surface of frozen ground, new life is preparing, gathering its strength for another spring. The cycle continues, endlessly repeating, endlessly renewing. Each stage has its own purpose and beauty, the freshness of spring, the fullness of summer, the release of autumn, the rest of winter. None could exist without the others, and together they form a whole. The presence of death within this rhythm does not diminish life. It deepens it, giving each moment its poignancy. The same is true within our own lives. Childhood grows into youth, youth matures into adulthood, and adulthood moves toward old age. At each stage, something falls away while something else emerges. To cling desperately to one phase, refusing to let it pass, is to miss the unfolding of the next. The child must die into the adolescent into the adult into the elder. If we were to remain frozen at any stage, there would be no growth, no unfolding, no wisdom. The cycle of renewal asks us to trust in this movement, to recognize that every ending is also a beginning in disguise. Even within a single day, we see this pattern. The morning carries the birth of light, fresh and full of potential. Afternoon brings the fullness of activity, the heat of life in motion. Evening comes as a kind of soft decline, a fading into quiet reflection. And then night descends, a daily death, when everything dissolves into the darkness of sleep. But from that darkness, we awake again, reborn into another day. This cycle repeats itself endlessly, so familiar that we hardly notice it. Yet it mirrors the larger cycle of life and death itself. Each day teaches us the lesson that death is not final. It is simply part of renewal. In the cycle of renewal, nothing is wasted. The falling leaf becomes nourishment for the soil. The body that dies becomes food for the earth, sustaining new growth. The flame that burns out releases its energy as light and heat, which are never destroyed but transformed. The cycle shows us that death is not a negation, not an erasure, but a passage. It is the handing over of one form into another, the continuation of energy in new shapes and expressions. To see this is to soften the fear of endings, for endings are never what they appear to be. We often imagine renewal as something grand, as if it happens only in cosmic cycles of birth and death, or in great historical shifts. But renewal is present in every small moment. Each breath we take is a cycle of renewal. Each thought arises, lingers for a while, and fades, making space for another. Each heartbeat comes and goes, sustaining us in its rhythm. Even our identities, which we think of as solid and continuous, are renewed constantly. The person you are today is not quite the same as the one you were yesterday, and tomorrow you will be someone else again. Life is an unending process of renewal, happening so seamlessly that we mistake it for permanence. What makes the cycle of renewal so difficult to accept is our desire for constancy. We wish to hold on to what we love, to keep it fixed, unchanging, immortal. But in doing so, we resist the natural rhythm of life. Imagine a piece of music in which one beautiful note is struck and held forever. The sound would soon become unbearable, losing all meaning. Music requires the rise and fall, the coming and going of notes, the spaces of silence in between. In the same way, life requires change, requires death, requires renewal. Without the falling away, there could be no new creation, no unfolding melody. This cycle also teaches us about perspective. From within the moment of decline, things can look tragic, as though all is being lost. But from a larger view, decline is simply part of the movement toward renewal. The tree stripped bare in winter looks dead, yet we know it is not so. The seed buried in darkness looks gone, yet it is preparing to sprout. The caterpillar dissolves in its cocoon, yet it is becoming something entirely new. Each stage carries the seed of the next, though we may not see it at the time. Renewal is always hidden within death, waiting for its moment to appear. The cycle of renewal reminds us that we belong to this rhythm, that we are not separate from the larger movement of existence. Our lives, with their beginnings and endings, are woven into this great pattern. When we try to escape it, we suffer, for we are resisting the very nature of life itself. To see that death and life are interwoven, that they give rise to one another, is to begin to understand that nothing is ever truly lost. At the root of our unease with death lies not the event itself, but the fear of what we imagine it to be. It is the fear of non-being, the terror of slipping into nothingness, of dissolving into silence where I no longer exist. This fear colors our lives in subtle ways, keeping us grasping at continuity, clinging to identities, and seeking permanence in a world that is endlessly changing. The irony is that we fear something we cannot ever truly experience. For non, being is not an experience, but the absence of one, and yet this very absence haunts us more than anything else. When you think of your own death, what image arises? For many, it is like falling into a vast black void, an endless abyss. The mind imagines itself conscious within nothingness, trapped in a state of absence. But notice how contradictory this is. You cannot be aware of nothing, because the very act of awareness requires something to appear within it. To imagine yourself experiencing nothingness is already to imagine something. The fear of non-being, therefore, is not really about death itself, but about the loss of control, the loss of familiarity, the loss of the story in which you have been the central character. This fear is deeply rooted in our sense of identity. We have been taught to believe that we are separate selves, defined by names, memories, possessions, and achievements. We build a sense of me, as though it were a solid object moving through time. Death threatens this entire construction. It whispers that the story of me may not go on, that the fragile collection of experiences and attachments might vanish in an instant. The fear of non-being is therefore the fear of losing the self-image we have so carefully built. Yet, when we look more closely, we see that this self has never been as fixed or solid as we imagined. It is a process, a flow, a pattern of thoughts and sensations arising and fading moment by moment. What dies is not something permanent, but a temporary form, like a ripple dissolving back into the water from which it came. Much of this fear comes from our inability to befriend impermanence. From childhood, we are conditioned to cling to people, to things, to moments, to identities, as though we could hold them forever. But life continually takes them from our grasp. Friends move away, possessions break, moments pass, bodies age. Each loss reminds us of the greater loss we will one day face. And instead of seeing this as the natural rhythm of life, we recoil from it, resisting, grieving, fearing. Yet impermanence is not something added to life. It is the very essence of life. To be alive is to be in motion, to be changing, to be endlessly appearing and disappearing. The fear of non-being arises because we want the river to stop flowing, because we hope to step out of time and keep our existence frozen. But the river does not stop, and we are the river itself. There is also a peculiar assumption behind the fear of non-being, that non-existence is somehow dreadful. But think for a moment about the time before you were born. You did not exist for centuries, for millennia. And was there any suffering in that? Was there any sense of dread, of loss, of absence? None at all. There was no awareness to suffer, no one to be deprived of existence. And so too with death. To not exist is not an experience of darkness or emptiness. It is no experience at all. The fear arises because we project our imagination into that space, as though our consciousness could linger there, mourning its own absence. But consciousness cannot mourn its own absence, because when it is gone, there is no one left to mourn. In truth, much of our fear of non-being is a fear of surrender. We live under the illusion that we are in control, steering our lives, directing our fate. Death exposes the fragility of this illusion. It shows us that we are not in control at all, that the very thing we cling to, our sense of self, was never truly ours to begin with. To face death is to face the fact that we are participants in a vast process, carried along by currents we do not command. The fear of non-being is the fear of giving up the role of the captain and recognizing ourselves as part of the ocean. And yet, even within life itself, we taste this dissolution all the time. In deep sleep, where there are no dreams, the self disappears completely. For hours, there is no me, no thought, no identity. And when we awaken, we do not say that those hours of non-being were terrifying. In fact, they were restful, peaceful, a renewal. In moments of deep absorption, listening to music, watching a sunset, or losing yourself in creative work, the boundaries of the self blur, and for a while, you dissolve into the experience. These small deaths, these dissolutions of the self, are not frightening but liberating. They remind us that non-being is not an enemy, but a return to the source from which being itself arises. When we think of rebirth, our minds often leap to grand metaphysical visions. Perhaps the soul departing from one body and entering another, or consciousness continuing in some unseen realm. But rebirth is not only a matter of what might happen after death. It is happening here and now, in every breath you take, in every thought that arises and dissolves, in every instant of life unfolding. To see rebirth as a constant process, rather than a distant promise, is to awaken to the richness of the present moment. To recognize that renewal is always available, as close as the air entering your lungs. Consider for a moment the breath itself. Each inhale is a beginning, fresh and full of life, drawing in the world around you. Each exhale is a release, a letting go, a small death that clears the way for the next breath to arrive. To hold on to one breath, refusing to exhale, would mean suffocation. It is only because you allow the breath to end that the next one can begin. This rhythm is the most immediate expression of rebirth, happening constantly within your body, unnoticed unless you stop to observe it. Life is not sustained by clinging, but by releasing, not by permanence, but by continual renewal. The same pattern can be seen in the flow of thoughts. A thought arises, lingers for a moment, and then passes away, making space for another. If every thought were permanent, if each one stayed fixed forever, the mind would become a stagnant pool, unable to move or adapt. But because thoughts die, the mind remains alive, fluid, creative. Each ending is the beginning of something new. Rebirth, then, is not only a cosmic event, but a psychological truth, occurring every time a thought dissolves and the space opens for another possibility. Even identity itself is subject to this ongoing rebirth. The you that existed yesterday is not precisely the you who exists now. Your body has shifted, your cells have aged or renewed. Your experiences have changed your perspective. At every moment, tiny deaths occur within you. The death of a cell, the fading of a memory, the passing of an emotion, and with them, new forms arise. You are not a fixed thing, but a process, a river flowing, never the same from one moment to the next. To imagine yourself as a solid entity is to resist the reality of this flow. To recognize yourself as a continual unfolding is to see that rebirth is your very nature. This rebirth is not always comfortable. Sometimes it comes disguised as loss, as the ending of something we wish to keep forever. A relationship dissolves, a role we played in life no longer fits, an old dream fades away. In those moments, it can feel as though something essential has died within us. Yet if we look more deeply, we find that these endings create the space for something new to emerge. Just as the forest fire clears the ground for fresh growth, so too do the small deaths in our lives prepare us for renewal. To resist them is to cling to what no longer is, but to accept them is to participate in the natural rhythm of rebirth. Rebirth also takes place in the shifts of awareness we experience. Think of those moments when you suddenly see something differently. A perspective changes, an insight dawns, a burden lifts. In that instant, the old way of seeing dies, and a new vision is born. It is as though you yourself have been remade, even though nothing outside has changed. These awakenings are rebirths of the mind, reminders that transformation is not bound by time, but available in any moment we allow ourselves to let go of what we thought we knew. Even sleep can be seen as a form of daily rebirth. Each night, the self dissolves into the darkness of unconsciousness, disappearing for hours. And yet, each morning, you awaken again, refreshed, renewed, stepping once more into the stream of life. The day before is gone, and while its traces linger in memory, you are not quite the same as you were. Life is offering itself anew, and in your waking, you are reborn into another chance, another perspective, another possibility. Rebirth in every moment also carries with it an invitation to forgiveness, both for others and for ourselves. If each moment is new, then the mistakes of the past need not bind us completely. We can allow them to die, to dissolve, so that we may live freshly. To hold on to guilt, anger, or resentment is to resist the natural rhythm of renewal. To release them is to allow rebirth to occur, not as some distant event, but here, in the present, within the heart. This understanding transforms how we approach life. Instead of living with the anxiety of what will happen at the final breath, we begin to see that death and rebirth are not postponed until then. They are woven into every instant. Each heartbeat is a tiny death and a tiny renewal. Each passing second is the end of what was and the birth of what is. To awaken to this truth is to no longer fear death as a single catastrophic event, but to recognize it as the continuation of a process we are already living. So, when we speak of death, let us not imagine a wall at the end of the road, nor avoid waiting to devour what we are. Let us see instead the deeper rhythm, the illusion of finality giving way to transformation, the cycle of renewal carrying all things forward, the fear of non being melting once we realize there is no one to suffer it. And the quiet truth that rebirth is happening in every breath, every heartbeat, every instant of letting go. To understand this is not to conquer death, but to see it clearly for what it is, a movement within the great dance of existence. In this recognition, life ceases to be something we cling to desperately and becomes something we participate in freely. Every moment is given back to us, not as something to hoard, but as something to live fully, because it is always arising, always perishing, always being born again.